Important. You know, our theme for the year is closer to God, closer to one another, and closer to the people in the world that don't know God. And this morning, this lesson is more along the lines of drawing closer to people who do not know God and what it takes. And what we're going to do, we're going to start off with two passages. And I would ask this question as we get into it. How do you see people? What is your heart for people? How do you respond to the world's needs? I want us to see a contrast here between Jesus and the most religious people of his day. Right. You know, when religion goes bad, it's one of the worst things in the world. And in Jesus' day, religion had largely gone bad. But notice the difference, the way Jesus saw people and the way the Pharisees, who were the predominant religious denomination of their day, and notice how they saw people. I'm reading from Luke 18, 9 through 14. And it says this: "To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. 'God, I thank you I'm not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I give a tenth of all I get.' But the tax collector stood at a distance, and he would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, 'God, have mercy on me, a sinner.' Amen. And I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." The key lines here: to those who are confident in their own righteousness and look down on everybody else. How the Pharisees saw people had such an impact on their impact with other people, how people felt about them, and their relationship with God. Now listen to what it says about Jesus in Matthew chapter 9, verse 35. "Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he said to his disciples, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field.'" The Pharisees, prideful, self-righteous, looking down on people. Jesus, compassionate. Well, what is compassion? Well, I think there's an event that we can all go back to, and I'll bet you felt compassion. Newtown. Is it Sunny Hook? Was that the name of it? What is it?
Sandy Hook.
Sandy Hook. But remember hearing about 26 and 7-year-old children being riddled with bullets? Remember how you felt? And if you heard them describing that all the parents came together in one building to be reunited with their children, and the children came rushing in, and their parents grabbed them up and loved them, and then somebody got up and said, "If your child is not with you, your child is not coming." Remember how you felt? That's compassion. It's to be moved deeply by something. It's to really care. Jesus really cared. There are so many times in the New Testament, in the Gospels, where it describes the compassion of Jesus. And it's one of those words, again, that you can just read and kind of go over it and not really stop and really consider what that's saying about Jesus. But Jesus was compassionate. Here are some examples. He was moved, and the very word compassion is used here. He felt compassion for the sick, the blind, and the lepers. People who were sick. We have a nurse here visiting with us this morning. I know you've seen some people that you've had great compassion for in the hospital. In fact, she was Gerald's nurse, and you know he needs all the compassion.
Amen.
Amen. But we're glad to have you, and all of you are busy. Lepers, they were outcasts from the time they were lepers and diagnosed as lepers. They didn't have anybody to touch them, to hold them, to talk to them unless it was another leper. And it says Jesus had compassion for them. Matthew 14:14, Matthew 20:34, Mark 9:22. All of those passages talk about the compassion of Jesus. Jesus he and his disciples are moving along, and a funeral procession interrupts their travel. And Jesus finds out that it's a widow whose only child has died. And it says that the widow of Nain, that Jesus had compassion on her and raised her son. He was moved at the grief that people felt. You remember in the story of Lazarus, who was one of Jesus' friends, and his family were close friends, and Jesus came. And the shortest verse in the Bible, what does it say?
Jesus wept.
Jesus wept. What did he weep for? Did he know that Lazarus was going to be okay? He was in God's hands? Yeah, he did. You know what he moved him? Was the grief that people were feeling about Lazarus. Jesus was moved by people's grief. And then in this passage that I read, he sees the crowd, hundreds, perhaps thousands, and he looked at that crowd and he said that he had compassion on them. When I see a crowd, do I always feel compassion, or do I ever see that crowd for what they represent? Probably not. But Jesus did. He saw these people come out, the lonely, the hurting, the sick, the sin-ridden, the people that had the greatest needs, and he had great compassion for them. And he described them, they're like sheep without a shepherd. Now, we don't live in sheep country. We lived in Wyoming for a while, which was some sheep country. Sheep are kind of have the reputation of being one of the dumbest animals around. They're probably no dumber than any other animal, but they tend to be very dependent on the shepherd and who's taking care of them. Lead them to water, lead them to pasture. They're easy prey. I remember in Wyoming, and I've mentioned this before, I remember in Wyoming, coyotes would get into a herd of sheep, a flock of sheep, and just decimate them because they had no defense. They were just, that's the way sheep are. And Jesus looks at people in this crowd, and he has compassion for them because he sees them as harassed and helpless. Their lives are lives of desperation. And how else to explain the cross than by the word compassion? What other motive could Jesus have had? He didn't get rich from it. He didn't get a great deal of fame. When you go to be crucified as a criminal, that's not a big fame-drawing thing. I mean, what other motive did God have in sending his son into this world except his compassion for the world? And why else would Jesus go to the cross except his compassion for us and our needs? The Pharisees, on the other hand, do you know there's not a single, they're all through the Gospels, but there is not a single reference to compassion when it came to the Pharisees. They were not known as being compassionate. They were known for other things, but not that. Remember Jesus giving the parable of the Good Samaritan? You know, when you give an analogy, it has to fit people's experience. And Jesus described a man that was beaten and left alongside the road. And a Levite came by, a priest came by, and neither one of them paid a bit of attention to him. And then a lowly Samaritan came by that the Jews hated, and he helped the guy and took care of him. And what Jesus was saying is, a lot of the religious leaders don't have any compassion. They don't have any real caring. And that was true of his day. They referred to the people as the Am Haaretz in the Hebrew language, the people of the land. And they had very little use for them. One of them was a friend of sinners, and the other one was disdainful of sinners. You know, Jesus was accused on several different occasions of being a friend of sinners. That's an interesting thing. What does that mean? Well, he went to people's houses that were godless in many ways. And he went to their houses, he ate with them. What do you think Jesus was like? I'll bet you there was one thing that stood out about Jesus that really attracted people to him. They knew he cared. Why did he make friends? Why were they drawn to him? Why would they even invite this guy who wasn't like them in many respects? Why would they even have him come? Because they had learned that he was a man who cared. He befriended them. They enjoyed being with him. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were busy locking sinners out of their exclusive group. They built walls. They formed an exclusive religious club. And they didn't want sinners really getting into it. You know, years ago, I was with a congregation. We started campus ministry. Now, I'll never forget, we started reaching some of the campus students, and they became Christians, and they started coming into the church. Now, they came from all kinds of different backgrounds, all kinds of different, from addictions, immorality, you name it, just like the world. And there were people in that church that said, we don't want these people here affiliated with our kids. We don't want them here. Now, there was few, but that's the attitude of the Pharisees. If you can meet my standard, I'll welcome you. But if you can't, I don't really want you. Jesus was a person of great compassion. Jesus had an impact on people's lives. The Pharisees really did. But here's another thing that stands out. The world confuses compassion with sentimentalism. And a lot of times the world looks at Jesus, Jesus loved people. Jesus loved everybody. Jesus accepted everything. Jesus, I'm okay, you're okay. Jesus, that's sentimentalism. Jesus was not a sentimentalist. He was not someone that said, if you're caught up in this, then that's okay. You're okay, I'm okay. We all get caught up in things. It's kind of like this. Imagine Dr. Otero having one of your children, you take one of your children to Angela's, and she sits down and she diagnosed your child with a serious illness. And she sits there and she just cries, and she's so sorry that your child is sick. But she doesn't do a thing to deal with the disease. That's sentimentalism. Jesus said, I've come to save sinners, but he didn't come to give them license. He came to say, that's destroying your life. There's a better way. And he cared enough to speak the truth to them. Turn over to John chapter 8, beginning with verse 1. John chapter 8, beginning with verse 1. This is a great example of what I'm talking about here. It's a well-known story. One of the stories that, one of the most beautiful stories about Jesus' interaction with people we'll find. But in verse 1 it says, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and at dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery, and they made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery, and in the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say? And they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Great compassion for this woman. Jesus knew they didn't care about this woman. They just wanted to trick him. They were using her. Jesus cared about this woman. And he said, all right, the first one, if you don't have any sin, you be the first one to throw a rock at her head. And the interesting thing is, they said from the oldest to the youngest, they started walking away. You ever think about why the older ones walked away first? Because they had more experience with sin. And the young ones had this sense of, well, who am I? I've never sinned. But they walked away. Nobody threw a stone at her. And we might stop the story right there and say, you know, Jesus accepted this woman in her adultery and just left her in that state. But let's go on and read what he says. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. And Jesus straightened up and asked her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir. Then neither do I condemn you. And Jesus declared, Go now and leave your life of sin. He didn't leave her in the same state that she was in. He said, go and leave your life of sin. And that's the message of Jesus all through the Gospels, is not just that he cared and loved, but he addressed the issues that were destroying people's lives. And that's what we must do as well. You know, as I did this lesson, as I thought about this lesson, I thought, man, I want to be more like Jesus. And less like the Pharisees. And I know that you do too. Wouldn't it be something to have a day of being with Jesus and learning from him, really learning from him, observing him, seeing how he related to people, seeing how he conducted himself with people, and to learn the characteristics of Jesus. You know, one of the things we would see, one of the things that would probably just stagger us, is how much Jesus cared about people. How much compassion he had for people. You know, I want to have compassion on the people who sin differently than I do. Now, did you get that? You know, we can look at our sins and we think, well, you know, I've got my sins, but, and we've dealt with we've dealt with some terrible sins in our own lives. But it's human nature to turn around and somebody that sins differently, and we look down on them. What are you doing? Jesus wasn't that way. And I want to have the compassion on people who sin differently than I do. I want to be able to see my family through Jesus' eyes. And I'm not talking just our immediate family, but our extended family, immediate and extended. You know, I bet you, if you're like my family's riddled with people in desperate situations, broken marriages, broken lives, addictions. And you can look at them and you can think, man, you really messed up. Or you can look at them in terms of, there but by the grace of God go I. And to have compassion, but the kind of compassion that will reach out and try to help if they're willing to be helped. We need to see the weak, the weary, and the wounded in the church through Jesus' eyes. We need to see each other that way. You know, we're going to mess up. People are going to mess up. And we can be hard on each other, or we can be compassionate and deal with the issues that we need to deal with, but be compassionate about it. Acquaintances at work. I bet every one of you have situations at work where people's lives are messed up. How do you see them? Do you see them as the mess-ups? I don't want anything to do with that person. Or do you see them as, I really know what would help that person? We look at the world's, all the messages we see on the evening news. Does it just make us mad? Or do we feel some compassion for what's going on in our world? Jesus looked at the world with compassion. You know, Jesus rebuked at times. Remember the chapter in Matthew chapter 23 where he goes after the Pharisees? He calls them hypocrites. He says you're like whitewashed tombs. On the outside you look good, on the inside you're full of dead men's bones. He really went after them. And then that chapter closes with these words. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those that come after them to help you. How often I would have taken your children as a hen takes her chicks under its wings, and you would not. Even in Jesus' rebuke, it is a rebuke of compassion. It isn't a rebuke, I'm going to get these people told. I'm going to set them straight. He's very strong in what he says, but there's compassion in it. There's a heart in it that isn't just a condemning heart, but a heart that wants to do something. Jesus hurt over those people, even though he rebuked them solidly. He knew that that superficial, hypocritical religion was destroying them and destroying other people. And he went after it. The Apostle Paul wrote this in his letter to the Colossians. And it's a great passage to meditate on in your quiet time during the week. But he wrote this, Colossians 3, verse 12. He says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy, dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. I find that sometimes in the kingdom, especially with us men, we like the strong ones. We like the courage and the talking straight and all this. Jesus was strong in the soft qualities as well. As somebody said, Jesus was a man of steel and velvet. And he knew when to be velvet, and there was always a velvet strain that ran through every part of him, even the steel part. And may we not just be men, but men and women of steel and velvet. May we learn from the Lord to be more compassionate, more caring, that our family knows we care about them, that our friends know we care about them, that the acquaintances that we come across in any way that we can, we care what's going on in your life. Jesus had tremendous impact. And a lot of it was due to the fact that he cared. We will have impact if we care. And that's really what it comes down to. I want to close the lesson, and I'm going to ask James and Scott and Ruby to come up.